Good morning around the world. I'm going to take a little bit of time at the beginning of this 9 o'clock meeting to introduce someone who probably does not need an introduction, but I like to talk about him. So I started to fall in love with Trey before I even met him. His email address is LLCoolTrey. And for this 80s girl who grew up listening to Ladies Love Cool James, LL Cool J, and who might have had a cool or two, spelled with a K, I was especially enamored with this email address that showed up asking about the Legacy Academy of Kingdom Living. And so this dude shows up for the Legacy Academy of Kingdom Living week after week, and this dude shows up to be ordained, and this dude shows up again and again and again. And we all start to fall in love with him. His brain, his heart, his family, his sonship. And I was kind of comparing him to Paul yesterday. And he's a great writer. You guys are going to find that out. He's going to be the best-selling author of Friend of the Bridegroom, which will be the third book published by S. Press. But he is also, I think, a more accomplished speaker than Paul, because no one would call Trey a poor speaker. I suspect he's taller than Paul, and he's real to us. And I think, like Paul, he longs to be with us. He lives in North Carolina, and so he can't be with us all the time, but he is only ever as far away as the tip of our arm, right? So he calls us, and we call him, and we get to be connected in a really special way, even though we're not in the same town. This week, however, he is in the same town, and it is my great privilege and honor to introduce my beloved friend and brother, the Apostle, Trey Poston.
It's great to be here. I passed through West Virginia, and at the last toll, it cost me like $16 to get here, right? You got to pay to be here. You got to pay to get to heaven. But the last toll that you hit, they've got a hashtag that says #almost heaven in West Virginia. Well, when you cross the Ohio line, you're there. You're there. It's an honor to be here. I didn't know that I would be teaching the 9 a.m. until about 2 days ago. Tommy asked me if I would handle it because he completely forgot that Dr. Ricky was supposed to be going with him to Texas. And I was like, dude, you're asking an awful lot. And that's a plethora. But anyway, I decided to call him back. He had asked me, he said, well, why don't you talk about fivefold ministry, right? Because you've got a good handle on it. I said, well, let me think about it. And apparently I decided to. But what I want to do now is, some people don't have a full understanding of the fivefold ministry, right? Sometimes it's hard to articulate what each role and which each office is responsible for. So I decided to write a story. But I didn't write it. Actually, Disney wrote it. But I'm going to show you the fivefold ministry in The Lion King, because the Bible says that Christ is all and in all. And if you know where to look and you know how to look, you'll always find him, right? So I'm going to start the story because this is about a 30-minute long story. So there once was a kingdom beneath a vast African sky where everything seemed to understand that it belonged to something larger than itself. The herds moved across the plains, the birds crossed the sky. Elephants traveled paths worn into the earth by generations that had gone before them. Water moved through the land, grass rose from the soil, and predators hunted, prey multiplied, and life fed life. Death returned to the earth, and from the earth life came again, and above it all stood Pride Rock. It was more than a place of authority. It was the visible center of an order, and from its height, a king could look across the land and see not only what belonged to him, but what had been entrusted to him. And one morning, something happened that caused the entire kingdom to gather. A son had been born, and his name was Simba. And the kingdom already had a king. It was Mufasa. And Mufasa was respected and feared by those who opposed the order of the kingdom. But Mufasa understood something about kingship that Simba would take years to learn. It was that authority was not simply just the right to rule, but that authority carried responsibility. So when Simba was born, the kingdom wasn't merely celebrating another lion, it was celebrating an heir. Before Simba had ever done anything, he belonged to an inheritance. And before he could hunt, he was an heir. Before he understood the kingdom, he was an heir. And before he knew his own name, he was an heir. Before he had demonstrated any sort of character or strength or wisdom or leadership, the kingdom already recognized something about him that he was too far young to understand. And it was that he was a son. And that reminds me of Paul's words in Galatians 4 that says, "Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all." And I want you to think about that. Though he be Lord of all. Everything can already belong to the heir while the heir is still too immature to carry what belongs to him. And that was Simba. His sonship was settled. His maturity was not. His inheritance was established. His understanding was still developing. And the great question of Simba's life would never really be, will he become a son? Because he already was one. And from the beginning, there were voices surrounding Simba that would contribute something necessary to that maturation. There were different voices and different functions and different graces. Yet somehow all of them would work toward one destination, a mature son. And as Simba grew, his father began to talk to him about the kingdom, and Mufasa showed him all the land. He showed him the boundaries. He showed him the order. He showed him how one life was connected to another life. Simba saw territory, but Mufasa saw responsibility. Simba imagined what it would be like to stand upon Pride Rock and have everyone recognize him as king. But Mufasa wanted him to understand what being a king actually meant. Because a crown without character can destroy a kingdom. An inheritance carried without maturity can become a curse to the very people it was intended to bless. So Mufasa began laying something inside of his son. He told him, he said, "This is the kingdom you were born into, and this is the order that existed before you. This is your place within it, and this is what authority is for. And this is what has been entrusted to our house." And he was giving Simba more than instructions. He was giving Simba a foundation. And Paul once described his apostolic ministry with these words in 1 Corinthians 3. He says, "And according to the grace of God which is given unto me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation." See, that's what the apostolic does. It establishes, it lays foundation, it reveals kingdom order. It says, this is what the Father intended. This is what everything's being built upon. And this is the inheritance. This is the government of the kingdom. This is the order. And Mufasa was doing apostolic work in the life of his son. He wasn't trying to make Simba spend the rest of his life admiring Mufasa. He was preparing Simba to eventually stand where Mufasa stood. True apostolic ministry doesn't create permanent dependence upon an apostle. It lays a foundation strong enough for sons to stand on. Mufasa wanted Simba to eventually carry in maturity what Mufasa was already carrying. But Simba was still a child. He heard his father, and yet he stood everything through immature eyes. And when Mufasa spoke of the kingdom, Simba was hearing opportunity. And when Mufasa spoke of responsibility, Simba only heard restriction. When Mufasa spoke of boundaries, Simba wanted to know what was beyond the boundaries. See, that's what immaturity does. And a child can hear the truth and still interpret it through childhood. So Simba needed another voice. And that voice often came through Zazu, the bird. See, Zazu wasn't as impressive the same way as Mufasa was. He didn't possess strength like a lion. He didn't carry the same royal presence. And Simba didn't always appreciate him. But Zazu seemed to have information about everything. Where Simba should go, where he shouldn't go, what was dangerous, what was expected of him, what was happening throughout the kingdom. Simba wanted to be adventurous, but Zazu gave instruction. Zazu gave understanding, and Zazu wanted him to learn. See, there's something about teaching that can feel unnecessary to someone who hasn't yet discovered how dangerous ignorance can become once authority is placed upon an individual. So Zazu taught, and Paul would later tell Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show thyself approved, rightly dividing the word of truth, because the inheritance that we receive doesn't remove our need for understanding. Being a son doesn't mean that we automatically know how the Father's kingdom works and operates. And you can possess something spiritually before you understand how to express it maturely. And the teacher helps bring understanding up to the level of your inheritance. Mufasa could say, this is your kingdom, but someone still had to teach Simba how the kingdom functioned. Someone had to give names to things. Someone had to explain relationships, how to communicate order. And someone had to keep telling an impatient son truths that he might not value until years later. And that was Zazu, the teaching voice. And Simba would need everything being deposited into him because another voice was already working nearby, a voice that wanted to undo everything that the Father had said. And that voice was the voice of Scar, Mufasa's brother. See, Scar understood exactly who Simba was. In fact, that was the very reason Simba troubled him. Scar wasn't threatened by Simba's present ability because Simba was a cub. Scar was older, stronger, more experienced, but Simba couldn't presently take anything from Scar. What threatened Scar wasn't Simba's present, it was Simba's future. Scar understood what Simba himself barely comprehended, and it was that the cub was an heir. And sometimes darkness will recognize the potential of sonship before the son recognizes it himself. So Scar looked at Simba and saw the one standing between him and the throne. So he began doing what accusation always does. He attacked perception. Scar knew that if he could distort the way that Simba saw himself, he might not ever need to defeat him in battle. And if you can make a son believe that he doesn't belong, he may remove himself from his own inheritance. And eventually Scar's scheme led to Simba into a terrible moment. A stampede tore across the land, and Mufasa came to save his son. And the father entered into the danger because the son was in trouble. And Mufasa rescued Simba. But in the chaos, Mufasa died. And Simba found his father lying motionless. The cub approached the great lion who had seemed indestructible. And he nudged him. He touched him. He called his name. And there was nothing. And then Scar came. And Scar found a son in shock. A son that was grieving. A son too young to interpret what had just happened. But Scar supplied the interpretation. And he persuaded Simba that Mufasa's death was his fault. And that may have been Scar's greatest victory. Not killing Mufasa, not taking Pride Rock, but convincing a son to agree with an accusation that the father had never spoken. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 10 that we're to be casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. So you think about that wording, something can rise inside the mind and exalt itself above what God knows. And the question was no longer simply, what does Simba think about Simba? The deeper question was, does Simba's opinion of himself agree with what his father knows about him? And Mufasa had said in everything he had taught him, you're my son, you're my heir, you have a place here. Scar effectively said that you're guilty, you've ruined everything, and you don't belong here. And Simba believed Scar. See, that's how powerful a lie can become when it's received as identity. Scar never had to put chains around Simba. He only had to convince the son that he should leave. So Simba ran. He ran away from Pride Rock, away from his inheritance, away from his father's kingdom, away from responsibility and anyone who knew who he truly was. And the son exiled himself. Proverbs 23 says, for as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So Simba didn't stop being a son when he ran. He just stopped thinking like one. His legal relationship hadn't changed. Only his perception had. He was still the heir whenever he crossed into the desert, still the son, still the rightful king, but he was now living contrary to what was true of him. And this is where the story becomes much larger than just Simba, because Simba probably thought that his exile only affected himself. But back at Pride Rock, the entire kingdom was beginning to change. Scar had taken the throne, and gradually the kingdom that had flourished under Mufasa began to die. The grass disappeared, the herds left, water became scarce, the earth cracked beneath the heat. The balance that Mufasa had taught Simba about began collapsing. And what had once been green became gray, and what had become fruitful was now barren, and what had been alive was now desperate. See, Scar's government consumed, but it didn't cultivate, didn't know how to steward. It used creation, but it didn't serve creation. And the land itself seemed to groan beneath an order that had never been designed to serve. Because the answer to creation's frustration already existed. The son didn't need to be born, he was already born. He didn't need to be chosen, he was already chosen. The kingdom didn't need God to create another answer. It already had an answer that was living in exile because he believed a lie about himself. And if I could stop the story just for a moment, because there's a passage in Romans that almost seems to rise out of the cracked soil of Pride Rock. In Romans 8, it says that the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. And if you look at Pride Rock, that creation was subjected to frustration. Creation not functioning according to its intended order. Creation groaning and waiting. And Paul tells us what creation's waiting for. It's waiting for the manifestation of a son. Not the creation of son, but the unveiling, the revealing. And something can be completely real and still remain hidden. Simba was already a son, but Pride Rock couldn't presently experience anything of his sonship because the son was hidden. And perhaps that's one of the strongest pictures in the entire story. The son didn't need to become a son. The son just needed to be revealed. And the Pride lands were suffering while the son lived beneath his identity. Creation was groaning while an heir was hiding. And the kingdom was barren while the one born to steward it was convincing himself that exile was where he belonged. And while Pride Rock groaned, Simba was trying to forget. Simba had crossed into another world, and there he met Timon and Pumbaa. Now, Timon and Pumbaa didn't know his history. They didn't know his lineage. They didn't know he was an heir. They simply found someone who needed help, and they cared for him. They gave him food. They gave him companionship. They taught him how to survive. They gave him somewhere to belong when shame had convinced him he no longer belonged anywhere. They laughed with him. They stayed with him. They helped him become strong again. They didn't restore his throne, but they preserved his life. And sometimes that's what true ministry is. Peter writes that we should just feed the flock of God, which is among you. And sometimes the pastoral doesn't begin by asking a person what their calling is. Sometimes it begins with, are you okay? Have you eaten? Do you have somewhere safe to stand? Can I walk beside you? Or can I even help you carry this load through this season? And before Simba was ready to confront Scar, somebody had to help the wounded son survive. Before he could carry responsibility again, he needed to experience relationship again. Before he could stand upon Pride Rock, he needed to learn that life could still contain joy. And that was the pastoral grace surrounding him. But there was a limitation, because pastoral care is necessary, but it can't become permission to remain immature forever. Simba had found safety, but safety gradually became hiding, and he learned to live with the burden of his identity. No expectations, no kingdom, no throne, no responsibility. No one there knew who his father was. No one there expected anything of him, and that felt like freedom. But there's a difference between peace and freedom. Simba was alive, but he wasn't becoming. He had healed enough to laugh, but not enough to return. And he had escaped the pain of his calling by escaping the calling itself. And while he lived comfortably in another land, Pride Rock was groaning. And then another voice found him, Nala. Nala had known Simba before the exile, and she remembered him as a cub. She lived through everything he had escaped, watched Pride Rock deteriorate, had seen the herds leave, knew the hunger, knew Scar's rule, knew the kingdom desperately needed change. And one day she crossed paths with Simba. And at first there was joy. Simba was alive. Nala quickly realized something. Simba had survived, but he'd forgotten. He had built an entire life around not remembering what was waiting for him. And Nala began telling him about Pride Rock, about the suffering, about Scar and the kingdom. And suddenly Simba was hearing news from a world he had tried to bury. And Nala carried a message into his exile. She was saying, there's another kingdom. There's somewhere that you belong. There's something larger than this place. And there's people waiting. And there's still hope because the son is still alive. Paul asked in Romans 10, and how shall they hear without a preacher? The evangelistical voice crosses boundaries, carrying news. It enters the world someone is settled into and announces another kingdom. It says there's more than what you presently see. There's another reality. There's a king, there's a hope, and there's somewhere to return to. Nala didn't create Simba's calling. She announced the kingdom to which his calling belonged. And she told him he needed to return. But Simba refused, because sometimes you can hear the truth about your calling and still believe a lie about yourself. Nala saw an answer while Simba was still seeing a failure. Nala saw the rightful king, but he still wanted to believe he had destroyed everything. She was trying to awaken his future. His imagination was still imprisoned by his past. So the evangelistic announcement got him thinking, but it couldn't get him home, because now Simba needed another voice, a strange voice, a voice that had recognized something in him before Simba could even speak. Rafiki. Rafiki had been present when Simba was born. He lifted the cub up before the kingdom. Long before Simba had accomplished anything, Rafiki had recognized what rested on his life. There's something prophetic about seeing maturity hidden inside of infancy, seeing calling hidden inside of weakness, destiny hidden in confusion, and seeing what the Father intends before a son even knows how to carry it. And years later, Rafiki found Simba again, but now the cub was grown. And physically, Simba looked like a king, but internally, he still saw himself through the eyes of shame. Rafiki began leading him through the wilderness. Simba followed him, led him through the brush, through the branches, through the darkness, until eventually they came to water. And Simba looked down and saw his own reflection. That's all he saw was himself. And Rafiki urged him, look again, look deeper. And something happened. The reflection began to change. And Simba began to recognize the image of his father in himself. And suddenly a verse from Paul becomes almost impossible not to hear. In 2 Corinthians, he says, but we all with open face, beholding as in a glass, the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image. And Simba looked into a reflection and discovered that the father he thought he had lost had been forming something inside of him all along. The father had laid something inside of him. The father's nature, his teaching, his order, his image. And Rafiki didn't give Simba a new identity. He revealed the identity shame had covered. See, that's the prophetic ministry at its best. Not manufacturing something artificial, but making people dependent upon another word, but actually saying, look again. You've interpreted yourself through a wound. You've interpreted yourself through a failure. And you've allowed accusation to tell you who you are, but you just need to look again. You saw yourself in the water and thought you were looking only at your own face. But if you look deeper, the Father's been forming his image in you all along. And then Simba encountered again the voice of his father. And the message was simple. He said, remember who you are. And here's what strikes me about that moment. The Father's concern wasn't Scar. The Father's concern wasn't the throne or the drought or the hyenas or the kingdom. Identity came before assignment, because action that flows from a false identity will eventually become distorted. And the Father calls the Son back to who he is. In 1 John it says, beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. But if you listen carefully, it says that now we are the sons of God, and yet it doesn't quite appear what we'll be. See, something can be already true of us and still await manifestation. Simba was already the son, already the heir, already connected to the Father, but it hadn't yet fully appeared what the Son would become. The Son didn't need to become a son, he just needed to be revealed. And there beside the water, something that had been buried for years began coming back to life. Mufasa's foundation was still there. Zazu's teaching was still there. Timon and Pumbaa's care had preserved him. Nala's announcement had awakened him, and Rafiki's revelation had uncovered him. And suddenly the 5 different graces began converging upon one purpose, a mature son. Now the story begins to look remarkably like something Paul writes in Ephesians 4 when he says that he gave some apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body, until we all come in the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God unto a perfect man, till we all come unto a perfect man, a mature man, a full-grown expression. Now, if you look at the voices that had surrounded Simba, Mufasa, the Apostolic, this is the kingdom, this is your inheritance, this is Father's order. And Zazu, the teacher, understand what's been given to you, understand how the kingdom works. Timon and Pumbaa, who had cared for him, the pastors, you're worth feeding, you're worth protecting. You don't have to die alone in the wilderness. And Nala had crossed into his world with an evangelistical announcement. There's a kingdom beyond this place. There is good news, and there is somewhere that you belong. And Rafiki had uncovered what was hidden, the prophetic, look again, remember, because the Father has never changed his mind about who you are. 5 voices, 5 graces, 1 son. Zazu's success couldn't be measured by Simba remaining forever incapable of understanding without him. Timon and Pumbaa's success couldn't be measured by Simba remaining permanently dependent upon their care. Nala's success couldn't be measured by Simba listening to announcements while refusing to move. Rafiki's success couldn't be measured by Simba returning every morning to ask, "What'd you see in the water?" Everything was moving toward maturity until we all come. The purpose of the fivefold ministry is not 5 ministries standing over immature sons forever, but it's 5 graces working until sons can stand. And now Simba stood and he knew what he had to do. He returned to Pride Rock. Nothing in the land of Pride Rock changed the moment Simba decided to return. The grass didn't instantly start growing. The rain didn't start immediately falling. Scar didn't suddenly vanish. Creation was still groaning, but something had changed. The answer was moving. And the son who had been hidden was coming out of exile. And every step Simba took toward Pride Rock was a step toward manifestation. For years, creation had been waiting for a son who was already alive, and now that son was coming home. He crossed the land and he climbed familiar terrain, and finally he saw Pride Rock. But it no longer looked like the kingdom of his childhood. The land was barren, the air was heavy, the earth itself carried the evidence of bad government. And for the first time, Simba could see what his absence had meant. He had thought that his exile was personal. He thought, I failed, I need to leave, I'm not worthy. But the kingdom had been affected by his self-exclusion. The land had suffered because the son had abandoned the place that belonged to him. And there's a sobering thought inside of that, because sometimes what we call personal insecurity has consequences beyond ourselves. And sometimes we think, I'm just not going to speak. I'm not going to lead. I'm not going to serve because I'm not qualified. Somebody else can do it. And we imagine that our self-exile is humility. But what if something's been connected to our obedience? What if there's a pride rock somewhere groaning while a son is hiding? Because creation has always responded to sons who properly carry the nature and the order of the Father. Romans 8 doesn't say creation is waiting for celebrities. It's waiting for the manifestation of sons. Simba entered the kingdom. Scar saw him. And Scar had once watched a frightened cub run away, but now a mature lion was walking toward the throne. And something about Simba looked familiar. The image of the Father had become visible in the Son. Paul says in Romans 8 that for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of the Son. See, maturity doesn't erase individuality. Simba didn't become Mufasa. He became Simba, but Mufasa's nature had become recognizable through Simba's unique expression. That's what sonship is. The Father's not creating clones. He's revealing his nature through sons who retained their own uniqueness with which he created them in. Same nature, unique expression. Simba looked like Simba, but Scar could see Mufasa. And darkness recognizes a mature son totally different than it recognizes an immature son. So Scar reached for the exact same weapon that had worked years before. He used shame. He reminded Simba of Mufasa's death. He tried to pull the mature lion back into the identity of the frightened cub. And for a moment, Simba began slipping backward emotionally, because old lies know exactly where old wounds live. But this time something was different. Simba had looked into the water, remembered his father, heard the prophetic call, heard Nala. He'd been cared for, he'd been taught. The foundation had been laid. Then the truth came out. Scar was the one responsible for Mufasa's death. And when truth exposes a lie, the identity that was built upon that lie collapses. Simba stopped running. He confronted Scar. And the battle that followed was about much more than two lions. It was the collision of two federal heads. It was the collision of two governments. One consumed while one stewarded. One ruled through fear, and the other would rule through sonship. One distorted truth, but one allowed truth to restore him. One kingdom had made creation groan, and the other carried the Father's order back into creation. And eventually Scar fell. And Simba looked upward toward Pride Rock, the place he had once abandoned, the place his father had occupied, the place his birth had pointed toward all along. And he began to climb, and then the rain began to fall. And step by step, the sun moved upward. Years before, he had been carried onto Pride Rock as a helpless cub, but now no one carried him. He reached the summit, and the kingdom waited. Creation waited. And Simba stood where his father had once stood. And in Hebrews 2:10, it says that he sat down at the right hand of God, from henceforth expecting till his enemies be made his footstool. See, Scripture contains the strange tension between now and until in Romans 8. Something can be established in truth and still move toward manifestation through experience. Simba had always been an heir. That was his now. But there had to be an until he matured, until accusation lost its power, until he returned, until the false government was removed, and until what belonged to him was placed beneath his feet. And then Simba roared. and creation answered, and the sound moved across the pride lands. The Son had been revealed, not created, but revealed. Then something remarkable happened. Rain begins to touch the dry earth, and the water returns. Grass began to grow, and the herds came back. And life began appearing in places that had looked dead. And the kingdom that had grown beneath frustration began moving toward liberty. And Paul's words come back again, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. You look at the relationship, creation, liberty, children, sons. The Lion King begins with creation gathering around the birth of a son. But the great crisis of the story is resolved when creation gets to experience the manifestation of a son. And at his birth, Simba possessed the identity, but at his maturity, the kingdom experienced the effect of that identity. The son had always belonged to Pride Rock, but now Pride Rock could experience the son. His inheritance had always been his, but now he was mature enough to steward it. The Father's image had always been within the story, and now it had become visible through the Son. And the Son didn't need to become a son. He only needed to be revealed. And suddenly the whole story makes sense. Why did Simba need Mufasa? For a foundation, and Zazu for understanding, Timon and Pumbaa for care, Nala for the announcement, and Rafiki for revelation. Why 5 different voices? It's because no single grace was intended to accomplish everything. The apostolic could establish him, but it couldn't replace the prophetic, and the prophetic could reveal him, but it couldn't replace the pastoral. Pastoral could care for him, but it couldn't replace the evangelistic, and the evangelistic could awaken him, but it couldn't replace the teaching, and the teacher could instruct him, but it couldn't replace the foundation. They were different, yet they all served the same purpose, to bring his son into maturity. This is why Paul says, until we all come. The goal isn't to build an audience around 5 gifted people. The goal is a mature body, mature sons, people that are capable of carrying what the Father has placed within them. And perhaps that's where the kingdom sometimes suffers, because we can become so fascinated with the voices that are supposed to mature us that we never really mature. We celebrate apostles, but we never build. We celebrate prophets, but we never learn to see. We celebrate evangelists, but never carry good news. We celebrate pastors, but we never learn to care for another person. We celebrate teachers, but remain forever dependent upon someone else to tell us what the Bible says. But Ephesians says, until. The 5-fold ministry carries an expiration point on immaturity. It's not an expiration on the gifts, but it's an expiration on the dependency upon remaining children. And the purpose of the ministry is to mature a people capable of expressing the Son. And if we look at the final scene, time has passed throughout the kingdom, and it's flourishing, and life has returned. And once more, the animals are being gathered beneath Pride Rock. And the scene feels awfully familiar, because now another child has been born, another generation, and Rafiki approaches again. Years before, Rafiki had lifted Simba, and when Simba was helpless, and he knew nothing of kingship, nothing of responsibility, nothing of exile, nothing of the journey. But now Simba stands above the kingdom as a mature son, and another child is lifted. And the story has come full circle, but something's changed. Simba's no longer just a son. The mature son has become a father. 1 Corinthians 4:13 says, for though ye have 10,000 instructors in Christ, yet have ye not many fathers. Maturity doesn't terminate in personal success. Mature sons eventually become capable of carrying another generation. What Mufasa had deposited into Simba can now move beyond Simba. Foundation becomes the inheritance. Inheritance becomes maturity. Maturity becomes fatherhood. And fatherhood produces another generation of sons. And creation gathers again because the kingdom always has an interest in what happens to sons. And the story began with creation celebrating a son who didn't understand his inheritance. It moved through immaturity, accusation, tragedy, exile, pastoral care, evangelistical awakening, prophetic revelation, and the teachings remembered, and the apostolic foundation restored, and finally, manifestation. And perhaps that's why this story resonates so deeply, because many people are somewhere inside of it. Some are standing beside Mufasa hearing things from the Father they don't yet understand. And some are irritated with Zazu because teaching feels slower than what they're getting to experience. Some are listening to Scar reinterpret their history. Some are running. Some are living in exile under a name that the Father never gave them. Some are with Timon and Pumbaa being cared for while wounds heal. Some have become comfortable in a place that was only intended to preserve them for a season. Some are hearing Nala say, there's more. There's a kingdom. You were made for something beyond this. Some are standing beside Rafiki's water, looking at themselves, seeing only failures, only limitations, only history, and the prophetic voices saying, look again. Some are just beginning to recognize the Father in the reflection. Some have already turned toward home. Some are walking back toward Pride Rock, wondering whether they really belong there. And some are confronting accusations that once drove them away. Some are climbing, and somewhere creation is waiting, because the earnest expectation of the creature is waiting, looking, expecting, watching, waiting for something hidden to become visible. And maybe creation isn't waiting for more sons to be born nearly as it is waiting for sons who already exist to be revealed. And maybe some of what we've called humility has actually been agreement with accusation. And maybe some of what we've called patience has been fear. And maybe some of what we've called waiting on God has been God waiting on us. Because Scar's greatest weapon wasn't physical strength, it was simply a lie. If Simba believed the lie, he would exile himself. And once the son removed himself, Scar could occupy what the son abandoned. But Scar's lie didn't change Simba's DNA. It didn't erase his father's blood. It didn't cancel the inheritance. It didn't change the kingdom's need. It only changed Simba's perception. And the journey back began when perception changed, when he looked again, and when he remembered who he was. And that's where the fivefold ministry matters. The apostle says to remember the foundation. The prophet, look again. The evangelist, the kingdom's beyond where you've settled. The pastor says, I'll walk with you while you heal. And the teacher says, let me help you understand what's been given to you. And all five voices ultimately say the same thing. Grow up into him. Become mature and let what the Father has declared become visible through you. Not so you can become important, not so you can sit on Pride Rock and be admired, but because kingdoms are affected by mature sons. Families are affected, churches are affected, communities are affected, and creation is affected. The mature son doesn't ascend merely to possess, he ascends to steward. Simba didn't return to Pride Rock so everyone could finally recognize how special he was. He returned because the kingdom needed the order of the Father expressed through a mature son. And that's where Romans 8 and Ephesians 4 collide. Ephesians 4 says that the gifts are working toward maturity, and Romans 8 says creation is waiting for that maturity. And fivefold ministry is what matures the Son. And then the manifested Son carries the Father's order into creation. So perhaps Pride Rock was never really waiting for a hero. It was waiting for an heir to remember who he was. And maybe the land wasn't asking for somebody with more talent. It was just asking for a rightful son to stop agreeing with a lie that had kept him away. And when the son finally stood, creation responded. The rain fell, the earth opened, and life returned. And the kingdom breathed again. Because the cub that had once been lifted before the kingdom, the son who had once run in shame, the heir who had once hidden from a responsibility, had finally matured enough to stand where the Father always knew he belonged, and all creation could finally see what the Father had known from the beginning, and it was that a Son had been revealed. I hope now you can understand, and I hope you can see now how vitally important the fivefold graces are to the body of Christ, right? Actually, how important you are to the body of Christ. That creation is waiting for you to step into your rightful place, right? I ran for years, right? It's only by the grace of God that I was able to find fathers in my life. It could be, I consider the guy that taught me electrical work a father in my life, right? Because he instilled things in me like work ethic. Now, I'm not saying it was easy. Like, he was borderline an abusive father, right? Like, have you ever had a job? Like, I started working with this guy when I was 19 years old. And I've never had another job where he was so mean that I was scared to quit because I thought he would come back. I thought he would hunt me down, come to my house, drag me out of the bed, and make me come to work. But he instilled work ethic in me. Now, I'm not going to lie. I was 19, 20 years old. I was sassy. I'd smart off at anybody. But the moment I smarted off at this guy, I've been slapped in my chest and thrown across the floor I don't know how many times, right? But the guy instilled something in me, and because of what I allowed him to instill in me, I now own my own electrical company, right? See, that's what fatherhood does. Whenever I got my electrical license, I don't know if I'll tell this story later, but to sum it up, I finally got my electrical license, right? And I called Mike. I called this guy, and I told him, and him and his wife were in the car together, and they both started crying when they found out that I got it. Well, it was about a week later, and Mike calls me, and he says, Trey, I need you to ride up to the house. I need you to help me with something. So I drive all the way up to his house in Stanley, and I pull up, and he's got his van open, and he's cleaning out the back of his van. And everything that he had two of, he gave me one of, right? I started my electrical company with $400 in my pocket. $400 in my pocket. But I had the knowledge and the wisdom and the understanding of a father that had been placed in my life. And then that father gave me tools to be able to begin the work, right? And after a period of years, my first year, I grossed $86,000, right? It doesn't seem like much. But then my next year, I continued to walk in the wisdom and knowledge and understanding. My second year, I grossed 186. Third year was 226. Fourth year was 326. And then the fifth year, my company was grossing roughly $500,000. And I started off with $400. But I also started off with the foundation, right? And with teaching and with the word over my life, right? And that's how fatherhood works. That's how the fivefold ministry works, right? We don't settle where we're at because somewhere out there, creation is waiting. Somebody needs a house wired, right? Somebody needs the very thing that God has placed inside of you because you yourself, he's a many-faceted God, right? He can't be bound to just one image. He's revealed himself and manifested himself in each and every person's unique expression on the earth. What does God look like? You've got 7.3 billion options right now to see what he looks like, right? 7.3 billion. And he's waiting on you to come into maturity. And he's given you gifts. And the gifts are the fivefold ministry. The Bible says if you'll humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, under the apostle, the prophet, the evangelist, the pastor, the teacher, then he'll exalt you in due season. I love you today.